Thank you. I'm Claudia Bester, Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum. This afternoon's lecture, Space is Relative, Matisse's Experiments, explores the evolution of Matisse's work during his middle years. It's the second in a four-part series examining Matisse's artistic journey, presented by distinguished art historian John Walsh. John Walsh led the Getty Museum from 1983 to 2000. During that time, he oversaw both the planning and completion of the Getty Center and reshaped the museum's collection through transformative acquisitions. Earlier in his career, he served as a paintings curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He supposedly retired 25 years ago, although clearly he didn't get the memo. So fortunately for all of us, Walsh has remained active as an educator and researcher and giving talks here at the Hammer Museum and at Yale University. His freely available online lectures on American and European art have now reached over 1 million viewers. This series continues with 2 more sessions, February 8th at 3 p.m. and February 22nd at 3 p.m. There's apparently some kind of obscure sporting event happening on February 8th with people throwing things, but never mind, this is going to be much more interesting. And after today's lecture, please join us in the theater lobby for coffee, tea, and cookies, and John will be available to take some questions. For those of you who are pursuing an A+ in this unofficial art history course, we have printed reading lists provided by John, and they're available here today and on the Hammer website. Our ability to present exceptional lectures like this one, exhibitions, and educational programs throughout the year depends on support from our members. So to the Hammer members and supporters here today, thank you so much. And if you're not and today's program resonates with you, we'd love to have you join our membership community. So now, please join me in welcoming the one and only John Walsh.
Thank you, Claudia. Welcome everybody in this room and the room next door, and also the audience online. Well, in the first lecture, we saw Matisse at the age of 35 discover places on the Mediterranean coast where his imagination and his genius for color could flourish. He had arrived in Saint-Tropez in 1904 and responded right away to the warm southern light by painting it with a vivid impressionist technique. Then we saw him experiment with dots of color that had been adopted by the so-called neo-impressionists that proved for Matisse just too laborious, too methodical for his temperament. After painting this view of the Gulf of Sunset on the right, using a mixed technique with some dots and dashes, he took it back to Paris and reworked it into a 4-foot wide painting with a title from Baudelaire, Luxe, Calme et Volupté. He had rethought the subject and made it into a kind of ideal tea party and beach party, which made a furor, but was realized, everybody realized it was a major statement. The pleasure of the imagery was going to stick with Matisse. The warm, vibrant light of the Mediterranean coast and the frank joy of nude bodies. We looked at the extraordinary summer of 1905, when Matisse and Derain worked together in the fishing village of Collioure and let go of the tradition of matching their colors to what they actually saw and experimenting with using their own instincts instead. In the autumn of that year, Matisse made a scandal by exhibiting this teeth-rattling painting of his wife and another of his daughter on the right in a kaleidoscope of colors. These got him, Matisse, and his group the nickname Fauve, wild beast. But whatever shock these pictures may have had in 1905, there were buyers for them. Sketches like these made in Collioure led to this painting, his only submission to the Independence exhibition of 1906, The Joy of Life, the Bonheur de Vivre, 8 feet wide. Well, I want to just have a leisurely look at it, and I want to show you a detail. And I'll just be quiet for a minute and have a sip of water while you look. Matisse was imagining an ideal state of being for humanity and for art. Old age, sickness, death were banished. Instead, there were eternal youth and health, as well as warmth and community. For Matisse, painting was the perfect way to celebrate that state by its design and, above all, by its color. Color that wasn't restricted to imitating the world in its true colors, but extraordinary colors that he could confer on ordinary things. He was free to improvise, free to stir his feelings and others, and suggest excitement or repose. On the left side, you can see impossible colors glowing up and over the people. At the right side, sinuous blue lines suggest tree trunks and branches and morph into the edges of foliage. On a lemon yellow field, the figures do what pleases them, singly or in pairs. In the center, 6 women dance in a circle. The 2 nudes in front are set off from the yellow ground by perfectly arbitrary red shadows below and green above, which define the sinuous curving edges of the women's bodies. They have almost no shading and are virtually weightless. And they make an aura, those shadows, around each of the figures. This subject, an earthly paradise, actually had a long history in the history of art that Matisse knew very well. In the first lecture, you saw this vision at the left here of 10 years before by his friend, the peaceable anarchist Paul Signac, that predicts that after the government is overthrown, a happy, classless utopian future will come. And you saw Matisse's painting at the right, the year before, that imagines a timeless era in which nude bathing and tea time could take place together in the last warm rays of sunset. Matisse referred to this picture as my Arcadia, the unspoiled place of classical antiquity, before civilization degraded it. Here, anything goes, happily. And in the very center, unencumbered by clothes, women dance in a circle that art lovers would recognize, a circle that was centuries old, with Poussin at the top. It's emblematic of the round of the seasons, a circle dance to music played by Father Time, lovely while it lasts. With Rubens below, it's a wild celebration of peasant vitality. And with William Blake at the bottom and A Midsummer Night's Dream, the protectors of marriage watch fairies dance in a circle. And closer to home, Matisse would certainly have seen the Sardana, which is the national dance of Catalonia, the traditional circle dance that was still performed just over the border in Collioure. He wouldn't have seen the Hora, but I'm including these kibbutzim to recall better times. Matisse assembled the joy of life out of studies that he had made the summer before in Collioure. What's unusual is that the setting seems to have come first. It grew out of landscape studies, like the sketch on the left showing an uphill path flanked by trees that he formed by stabs and flicks of green and blue. In the middle, another study introduces a nude sitting on the ground. Behind her is a hectic tangle of trees and leaves. The study at the right has a clearing in the woods and the blue sea beyond. It's empty of people, but the layout of colors is exactly the one he keeps and populates in the great big painting, which is 4 times wider. Then at the top, a tiny oil sketch there. He maps out the color zones in broad blocks, now including a foreground area with figures just suggested. And then below, a somewhat more detailed layout sketch, including all the figures. And notice with all of these changes, it's the colors that stay put. Well, we have some figure studies too. There at the far right, the drawing shows a young female playing the pipes in a languorous pose. In the middle, the girl standing at the far left in the painting is stretching upward, wearing only a vine of ivy. The amazing hot reds that he adds behind her on the left are unnatural, but ardent and joyful. Matisse was making a practice of studying figures with clay, too, and later making bronze casts of them. In this case, the figure is sitting and stretching, probably inspired the drawing and also the one in the painting. Well, having caused a storm in the previous Independence exhibition, Matisse showed this 8-foot wide painting as his only submission to the exhibition in 1906. It wasn't just ambitious, but it had a new and different calm about it, different from the more agitated, broken paint textures of his work before this. Matisse had a nice musical analogy for it. He said, I tried to replace the vibrato with a more responsive, more direct harmony, simple and frank enough to provide me with a restful surface. Well, this was all taken as a wrong turn by his mentor and friend, Signac. Signac came to see it and wrote to a friend, upon a canvas of 2.5 meters, he has surrounded some strange characters with a line as thick as your thumb. And then he's covered the whole thing with flat, well-defined tints, which, pure though they may be, strike me as disgusting. Others found it laughable, or worse. André Gide thought that Matisse's talent was being stifled by his own theory. I want to just remind you that the new freedom that Matisse gave to strong colors that didn't correspond to the actual things he painted, that was not exactly new. 2 of the heroes of Matisse and the Fauve group were still alive when Matisse was young, Van Gogh and Gauguin. Gauguin had amped up his colors to intensify our experience, to transfer his own sense of stoical resolve, express his joy at the vitality of the landscape, or convey the consolation of his own bedroom. All ordinary things. While Paul Gauguin was still working in France, his colors and his distorted scale tried to convey something of the strangeness of peasant life in Brittany, its quaintness and its superstitions. And Gauguin's younger followers, like Paul Sérusier at the upper right, didn't need to sail to Polynesia to apply his example of strong color to scenes at home. Gauguin, of course, associated strong color and freedom of color with a primitive society as he imagined it in Tahiti, a world of strange hues, flaming sun, warm air, and a sort of pre-Christian spirituality. And daydreams of innocence like this took even stranger forms around 1910 when the self-taught painter Henri Rousseau could imagine his mistress on a couch in a lush jungle Eden for the pleasure of his audience in Paris. There were mockers, but there were a few adventuresome visitors to the exhibition who had money. Two were Americans, a lawyer, Leo Stein, and his sister Gertrude, who had emigrated to Paris with enough family money from the streetcar business in San Francisco to live in a big apartment near Montparnasse. And there in the upper left, a blue arrow points to the Bonheur de Vivre, hanging up high in that apartment. And over at the right, the red arrow points to Gertrude Stein herself, painted by Picasso, now at the Metropolitan. The Steins had been following Matisse's work, and they had bought some of the toughest pictures in the previous salon, including the woman with the hat here, which Leo at first called offensive, a mess. Well, there it hangs in the middle, bumping Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein to the next row. This has got to be one of the great curatorial confrontations ever. Gertrude Stein's severe, a kind of a priestess or sibyl with a mask-like face. Amélie Matisse dressed to kill, weighed down by fashion with a kind of dubious expression. Picasso didn't often comment on his paintings, but when somebody complained that Gertrude didn't actually look like his portrait of her, he said, "She will." The Stein's brother Michael and his wife Sarah had arrived in Paris too. Sarah had an eye, and they were buying paintings. A lot of influential artists and writers had been coming to the Stein's apartments, including the 24-year-old Spanish emigre Picasso, who had not only painted the formidable Gertrude, but also drew her inscrutable brother Leo there in the lower middle. In March 1906, the Steins escorted Matisse to Picasso's ramshackle studio there in Montparnasse, in Montmartre, probably to look at his portrait of Gertrude. He and they had all seen Matisse's joy of life painting in the independent exhibitions and in other dealers' exhibitions. There were several of those, by the way, since a few dealers were catching on and even buying blocks of Matisse's work outright on the open, on spec, for prices that were a tiny fraction of what bigger names like Monet were getting at the same time. Matisse and Picasso recognized each other's power and originality. Picasso was 12 years younger, an immigrant, brilliant, fearless bohemian. Matisse was a solid, fastidious, inward, middle-class citizen. Matisse and Picasso had begun a long, friendly rivalry that you'll be hearing more about. Matisse's ambition and his blazing originality attracted another avid foreign collector, Sergei Shchukin, who'd been buying Impressionist and post-Impressionist paintings for 10 years or so, and taking them back to his 18th century palace in Moscow, where he had the custom of opening the rooms to public, anyone who would want to come, once a week. For Matisse, helping Shchukin decorate his vast walls became a vital source of encouragement and income. Come back to him in a moment. Shchukin had a competition from two remarkable sisters the Steins had known in Baltimore, Clarabelle and Etta Cohn. And here they are in Italy with Gertrude In the middle, a few years earlier, they made trips to Paris. They followed avant-garde developments. And with encouragement from the Steins, they became astute collectors, especially of Matisse and Picasso. They were not timid. This picture by Matisse is one that the Steins had bought and later sold to the Cohen sisters, who brought it back to Baltimore, where it's been ever since, part of the Cohen's gift to the Baltimore Museum of Art. Matisse had taken a trip to Algeria after painting the Bonheur de Vivre, and in the next year he exhibited this astonishing, almost life-size nude at the Independence exhibition in 1907. This is the picture that made a scandal in the Armory Show of 1913 in America, first in New York, and then especially in Chicago, where Matisse's paintings were burned in effigy by artists and art students. In the Baltimore Museum, it's shown near this statue by Matisse, originally a study in clay that he had later cast in bronze. The exotic flavor of the painting is added, accentuated by the palms here that Matisse put in the background, and also by its title, Memory of Biskra, which alludes to an oasis that Matisse traveled to in Algeria. He developed the complex pose from one that he'd just used in the Bonheur de Vivre, twisting, stretching, and I think ultimately derived from a classical source, the famous Hellenistic sleeping Ariadne. But Matisse's woman is waking up, and he gave it the title Aurora, Goddess of Dawn. After the sensation of the spring exhibition with this picture and its purchase by the Steins, Matisse returned to Collioure on the coast, where he found subjects that he had found earlier that met his needs for joy and ease. His most important works in the next few years are small groups of nude figures, mostly female, who inhabit a kind of pre-classical paradise. Matisse imagines them taking pleasure in bathing and music, dancing, games. Some appear in enigmatic, unfamiliar situations. A sketchy little pastoral on a hill above a village on the left with a faun playing pipes for two unclothed women and a child. It's a world where predatory men, or fauns, disturb the peace, but not very often. Here's a brutish satyr about to attack a sleeping girl, a nymph. There's nothing to locate them anywhere in particular, only the sparest suggestion of a landscape. Here on the right, the subject is still an enigma. 3 life-size women on an enormous canvas with just bands of green and blue to evoke a place by the sea. They're strangely elongated and somehow forlorn. They cast no shadows. They seem to have no weight. The painting impressed Schukin, and he wanted to buy it, but it had already been sold to a German collector, so Matisse painted this game of bowls for him. The 3 women are doing something with a turtle that, to my knowledge, nobody has explained, but writers keep trying. Here's a little statue by Maillot of a friend of Matisse's, of a squatting nude observing a crab that Matisse might well have seen in the studio. But unfortunately, that statue is just as mysterious as the painting. His new friend and rival, Picasso, had painted something far stranger during the previous summer. And it was probably provoked by seeing Matisse's vision of an earthly paradise. Picasso painted something like the opposite, a kind of hell, the workforce of a brothel, some of the workers with faces like grotesque tribal masks, a scene painted in a fractured style that's as audacious as the subject. Picasso didn't exhibit this picture for 10 more years. And in the meantime, word got around quickly. You had to go to his studio to see it. And in fact, it seems that Matisse did exactly that in the autumn of 1907. And he may well have seen this dancer by Picasso, too, the same size as Matisse's own notorious blue nude, and looking a lot like a parody of it. The woman rotated 90 degrees to standing. In any case, the Steins bought both these pictures and hung them in the same room, as though the apartment were a kind of neutral zone in the emerging struggle between pro-Matisse and pro-Picasso factions. Shortly, Picasso moved on to create a new race of naked women, massively muscular and bronzed, with very different kinds of energy, in a new kind of fractured space. This is a path Matisse chose not to follow, despite its appeal for his Russian collector Shchukin, who bought both of these. It's actually a good moment to remind ourselves of what went on in the Braque-Picasso camp during the next few years, that is, the emergence of Cubism. Georges Braque, on the right side, was painting landscapes in the summer of 1907 in the Mediterranean hills in a colorful but inoffensive style based on Matisse. The next summer, Braque began to do something much more radical at the left. Now the viewpoint is much closer to the village. It's tightly cropped on all sides, and the buildings seemed jumbled together. And there's some confusion in the geometry of the roofs and the other places. He's assembled a picture that doesn't resolve into a credible view. And those ambiguities are entirely intentional. He uses tan and green and gray, but not the actual red of the tile roofs there. The colors are abstracted, in other words, the way the buildings are. As Cubist inventors, Picasso and Braque said they were roped together like mountain climbers, changing the lead as they ascended. They were, of course, climbing a route that was pioneered by Cézanne. At the right, exploring geometry in the landscape and most of the other things they painted, including and especially still life. Picasso painted this one in overheated fauve colors, maybe impressed by Matisse, another picture that their mutual patron Shchukin bought and took to Moscow. Soon on the right, Picasso was using a sort of puritanical palette of tans and grays and abstracting the objects on the table to become nearly unrecognizable. By then, his figures were also broken into unstable planes that the viewer, had to work to put together. Young artists like Juan Gris, there in the middle, were learning Cubist techniques and creating systems of their own. This is Gris's homage to his master and friend, Picasso. Picasso's coterie was international and it grew large. Matisse stood aloof from it, but gradually began to experiment with some Cubist techniques. Then, as we'll see in the next lecture, he stopped. back to Matisse in 1908. His stay in Collioure that summer was broken by a trip to Tuscany and to Venice. He stayed with the Steins in Florence, and he had his first encounter with Giotto and Botticelli and other Renaissance masters. He was impressed and he was moved. And in Florence, it's sure that he met this life-size nude Venus, born of the sea, and quite likely he had her in mind as he experimented again with his own race of life-size women in a primal state of existence. His modern-day Venus, in two versions you see there at the right, is having her feet dried and is about to get a bouquet from a nude maiden who's in a hurry to render homage to her. In the distance, the hills of the Mediterranean coast around Collioure. You see his full-size sketch in the middle, done with oil paint, and the other one drawn in fine outline invoking Greek vase painting, executed with a glue-based medium in order to get a matte effect, an imitation of the Italian masters that he'd been studying and admiring. Friends of Matisse who bought this little nude remember it this way. We had come across a strange little canvas, something gripping, unheard of, frighteningly new, something that very nearly frightened the artist himself. On a harsh pink ground, flaming against dark blue shadows, was the seated figure of a violet-colored woman. We stared at her, stupefied, all four of us, and went on. The picture only made sense once you stopped trying to read it as a nude, but instead felt, from the patchwork of colors, sensations of dazzling light, heat, and shade. Matisse said, "You see, I wasn't trying to paint a woman. I wanted to paint my overall impression of the South." In 1908, Matisse was urged by some admirers to teach in a new small private academy for aspiring artists who, for some reason, didn't suit the official system, or vice versa. They rented space in a disused convent and had about 100 students, some of them French, most of them foreign, including some Americans. Matisse got a very large studio for his own projects, and these included portraits. Matisse could revive his renegade color sense if the subject called for it. We don't know who this woman was, possibly one of the students in his classes, but she provoked Matisse to give her a hypnotic portrait in the studio with paintings propped up behind her, and on the shelf above, big ceramic pots, plus a plaster torso. I suspect her exaggerated turtleneck and slightly comical hat and blouse may well have been art school fashion in 1908. Another portrait sitter was this young German sculptor, Greta Moll, who was studying with Matisse along with her partner, a painter husband, Oskar. The year before, she'd had her portrait painted by her earlier teacher in Berlin, Lovis Corinth, and she showed Matisse a photograph of this portrait. Matisse told her he thought he could do better for a fee of 1,000 francs. That was only $200. So Greta sat for him, 10 sessions, 3 hours each to get it right. So what was the struggle about? Later on, Matisse said he was trying to give her the grandeur of a portrait of similar character in the Louvre. I think it's this one, pretty surely. A portrait that had arms and a pose that were going to be the key to his portrait of Greta. But as he said, was nearly completely discouraged by not capturing the statuesque quality that he was after. So, did Matisse do better, or Corinth? What do you think? It's as though Greta had shed all that she had been in Corinth's portrait. The elaborate day dress and bonnet, the buds and the blossoms of her girlhood, the slight uncertainty of her eyebrows, all beautiful and sympathetic. Matisse painted a different Greta, forthright, her face unflattered, dignified, assured, holding her own in front of a fabric with tremendous blue pattern. I mentioned the bigger studio that Matisse now had. He was going to need it because he'd arranged with his dealer to paint large so-called decorations for Shishkin's palace in Moscow. And he'd gotten an okay from Shishkin that they would be another pair of very large images from an imaginary golden age. This first one shows a round dance of naked girls. You can see it was a reprise of the circle dance that we saw before in the distance. The first version didn't suit Shishkin's needs for one reason or another, so Matisse did it over again. First in a charcoal drawing and then on an even bigger canvas to suit the space of the owner's palace. The figures are well over life size, and they get their extra energy and strangeness from the orangey red skins set against the green and the blue of the earth and sky, stripped to their simplest. Shishkin had agreed to buy the dance painting and its companion, the piece, music, but when he saw them together in an exhibition in Paris, and he read some of the mocking criticism, he panicked at the thought that he'd be putting 10 giant, naked, red-skinned primitive humans on the walls of a house that he'd been opening regularly to the public, including to children. So he canceled the deal, but soon after he came around. Here they are in the Hermitage galleries. The second painting may be even stranger than the first. Standing at the left, a very tall woman personifying music plays a tiny violin that Matisse imagines as a pochette, the kind that is used in ballet rehearsals. A boy plays the pipes, and 3 men with open mouths are sitting and singing. I think they are Matisse's embodiment of early humans as artists of the senses, imagined in a time before history. They are Matisse's own nameless ancestors and Shishkin's. As you've heard, Matisse was keenly aware of Picasso and Braque and Cubism and the exploration of structure in painting. Cubism was about geometry, relationships of forms, balance, and the logical development of pictorial ideas. That was not for Matisse. For him, the heart of the matter was color. Listen to him explain. My picture, La Musique, was composed with a fine blue for the sky, the bluest of blues. The surface was colored to saturation, to the point where blue, the idea of absolute blue, was conclusively present. A bright green for the earth, and the vibrant vermilion for the bodies. With these 3 colors, I had my harmony of light and also purity of tone. But Matisse doesn't ignore form. He goes on. Notice the color was proportionate to the form. form was modified according to the interaction of neighboring colors. The expression came from the colored surface, which struck the spectator as a whole. So what he means by form here is 5 figures spaced at equal intervals, like the notes on a musical staff. It implied unity, 5 separate voices making one. That unity is a counterpart to the whirling circle of connected beings in the dance. As for the systematic development ideas as practiced by the artists in the Cubist circle, Matisse operated differently. He responded to his own emotions, whether looking at a potential subject in front of him or looking again at his own paintings, finished or unfinished. He describes this. I'm simply conscious of the forces I'm using, and I'm driven on by the idea that I really only grasp it as it grows with the picture. Contrary to the Cubist practice of deconstructing and reconstructing form, Matisse proceeded intuitively, in fits and starts, forward and back, comparing, correcting, fixing up, discarding, according to what he felt, and as he looked at his own work. That's why Greta Moll had to wait and endure 10 sittings for her portrait. It was Matisse's idea from the beginning that Shishkin would get 3 paintings, the dance, the music, and a scene there at the bottom of Bathers, which he described as a scene of repose, some people reclining on the grass, chatting or daydreaming. He sent this composition sketch to his client, but heard nothing more. Matisse was keen enough for the project to buy and stretch a canvas of the same enormous dimensions as the other 2 and begin work on it. We'll come back to it in the next lecture. The dance and music paintings made a deep impression on artists and critics who saw them in Paris before they left for Moscow. And the 27,000 francs that Shishkin finally paid for them stabilized Matisse's finances. You see hanging over the door, Matisse's dance. And on the left-hand wall, the red arrow, there's another picture that Shishkin had bought with 2 years earlier. It was a long leap forward for Matisse. The harmony in red. Remember that 10 years earlier, at the age of 27, Matisse had exhibited this painting in a show organized by artists, his first major work, which made a stir when some of the conservative critics found it too impressionist. Matisse returned to the subject, you might say, with a vengeance. Here he's displaying his belief in the exhilaration of color and pattern. This painting, Harmony in Red, began life under the title Harmony in Blue. And Shishkin bought it, but then Matisse wasn't satisfied with it and repainted everything that had been blue. And that was most of the picture, with bright red. The red tablecloth with an enormous 18th century floral pattern is a kind of fantasy based on the kind of real cloth that you have seen behind Greta Moll's portrait. This is one of the many fabrics that Matisse had collected, and so is the wallpaper based on it as well, identical in pattern to that of the tablecloth. This overlap of 2 planes here in the painting of the same color collapses the illusion of depth, but the chair and the window are a nod to the fiction that you might walk in and sit down and look out. The still life objects here keep their natural color and their believable placement, more or less. Fruit seems to wander across the table as it's still life tradition dictates, while the maid puts things in order. The trees outside are now just patterned white shapes. The printed vines and baskets and flowers on the wall and the table look more real than the real ones. Again, Matisse declares his independence from imitation. He relieves color from their traditional descriptive role and gives them a different job, to embody his own feelings about what he was looking at. He explained why he made the change from blue to red. It seemed insufficiently decorative to me, and I could do nothing else but go back to it, something I'm pleased with today. When somebody protested that this was virtually a different picture now that it was red instead of blue, Matisse declared, "There is no difference. It's the forces that I'm concerned with and the balance of forces." So it wasn't just color. Again, it was also forms that could live independently in his works and interact with one another. And as for picture space, it's lost its traditional job of being fictional but convincing stage and it's made it into an expressive actor in itself. All of this he explores for the rest of his career, but particularly intensely during the decades of the teens. Well, in the summer of 1909, Matisse and his family moved to a big, comfortable house in the southwestern suburbs of Paris, away from the pressures he felt in the city. There was a garden in back and a yard with enough room for a big studio that Matisse had built for him by a company that made prefab structures. There he could not only make new work, but could also surround himself with a changing display of his own paintings and sculptures. This studio turned into another kind of paradise for Matisse. In the house on the left there was a kind of high bourgeois comfort in the abundance of textiles from Africa and the Middle East. Figured tiles, wallpaper, patterns on patterns. The odd perspective lets us see all that and to observe the war games, in this case, of the boys Pierre and Jean, aged 12 and 13, and also notice the polite distance between the artist's wife, Amélie, there at the left, and her 17-year-old daughter, Marguerite, in sober black. The studio, the painting there at the right, was big enough for Matisse to reconfigure over and over with mirrors and screens and other ways to display textiles. Perspective was a matter of convenience, artistic license. He was free to invent new elements of decor, things that were never there in real life, like the 5 dotted flowers on the floor that he used again on the walls. Matisse, I should say, didn't invent the idea of painting well-to-do people in rooms upholstered with patterned fabric. Cézanne at the left included wallpaper and rugs and printed fabrics, the visual equivalent of music. Vuillard at the right made it a game, even a career out of it, introducing one unlikely fabric pattern to another, often just for the surprise and the pleasure of it. Just as Matisse did here in this still life, pattern on pattern in a broader style, but with fruits and flowers thrown in among the competing patterns. Matisse had encountered lavish patterns and arbitrary picture space in painted miniatures by Persian artists of 400 or 500 years earlier. He traveled all the way to an exhibition in Munich in 1910 and was impressed to find how they could both acknowledge 3 dimensions by overlapping planes, but ignore diminishing scale and atmosphere. Persians made pictures in a kind of parallel universe to contemporary Western traditions of illusion, telling their stories with brilliant colors and refined details. Here we get a wider angle view of the studio, emphasizing nudes in various media, but it's the patterned fabrics that are stage center. The rose-colored floor and the blue walls are true to the actual colors that Matisse had the studio painted. This famous picture started out as a painting of the same room. It had the same pink and blue colors when he painted his first version, until he decided to paint them both red, just as he'd done with Harmony in Red we saw before. It's a kind of hallucination. The painting amounts, though, to a kind of little exhibition of work, of which Matisse himself was the curator. You'll see on the table in the bottom is a still life of drawing implements and one of the painted plates that he'd begun to make together with the ceramicist Henri Matisse. And then on the table still a green glass vase, and this arabesque of nasturtium winds around a little nude terracotta statuette that he'd made. And you can see the lines of the table converge and lead our attention to a series of paintings on the wall, a big reclining nude propped up next to the door, and next to it a bunch of small pictures and frames on the floor, and on the wall a miscellany of pictures from a few years earlier. At the right edge there are two little statuettes, and above them the luxe again that you saw before. And that red skin he has now, she has now, was part of Matisse's repaint of the wall and floor. There's furniture in the room, but it's indicated by nothing more than outlines in yellow that survived the repaint. To give you an idea of what the first version must have looked like, before Matisse repainted the table and the floor and everything else, painted them a uniform red. Here's a little detail that the conservators generated digitally from X-rays and analyses of Matisse's paint layers. You can see it, ochre tabletop, pink floor, blue wall. What looks real in the studio is the work. The rest is a kind of dream. I said hallucination, but a dream for Matisse, who lived for his work. The place has become a kind of paradise for him, as well as a home. Fortunately, we can understand it better through the wonderful exhibition catalog about 4 years ago of the Museum of Modern Art, all about this painting and its contents. It's still in print. You can still buy a copy. It's worth having. In 1911 and 12, Matisse and his wife spent much of the winter in Morocco, making some paintings to bring home and drawings to work up later. One is a view out his window in Tangier, with a still life on the edge. And out beyond, some patches of sandy ground and a few people. And beyond that, several great landmarks, the Episcopal Church of St. Andrew, and above it, the Kasbah, which seemed to emerge and float like everything else on a barely differentiated blue, with the sea on the horizon. Most of the picture was Matisse's recollection, painted like a dream back in France. And you'll recognize this picture as the latest in a series of views out windows and doors that Matisse began long before in Brittany, in Picardy then, on the Mediterranean coast, each with a different emotional charge of longing, of regret, and pleasure. He found Moroccans to model for him, and he put them in settings that are semi-abstract and painted them nearly life-sized, frontally, to make most of their costumes and their confident attitude of repose. The woman here has taken off her slippers and just sits with folded legs covered by her patterned kaftan and looks at us. Or she may be looking at the glass bowl and the 3 goldfish in it. The only things in it, the picture, that would move. The goldfish bowl was a motif that Matisse drew from observation in Tangier, but he used it in the most radical composition to come out of his time in Morocco. This 7-foot wide painting, he gives it a border like a carpet, and at the top an arcade to suggest a place in the city. He has the coffee house customers sitting or lounging comfortably, faces blank, wearing identical djellabas and turbans. Downstage, 2 of them occupy their leisure by watching goldfish swimming in another elegant bowl placed next to a vase with flowers. This isn't a private place like the terrace where a woman is sitting, but a public place where one could have the kind of informal and meditative practice. These Moroccans in Matisse's imagination have found their own paradise, unburdened by work, detached from obligations, weightless in their world, the way the fish are in theirs. Or, I suggest, his music makers of prehistory are. These 2 hang in the same room in the Hermitage, by the way. Matisse was going to find many uses for goldfish, suggestive ones, metaphorical ones. I want to look for a minute at some of them. Back in France, he had a cylindrical goldfish bowl that appears again and again. Here it sits on his terrace. He pays a lot of attention to detail, to the mouths and the googly eyes of the fish, and the optical aspect too. The fish are doubled by the reflection on the surface of the water. They're part of an ensemble of leaves and flowers and furniture, all small luxuries that exist simply to give pleasure, for Matisse to paint as a fine-tuned ensemble and for us to enjoy. These fish at the right are in the studio with other objects of fascination for Matisse. The naked female form, the small sculpture next to the table, and in between the flowers and the vase. The female may look familiar to you. It's one we've seen. It's the one 4 years earlier that Matisse called Aurora, the goddess of dawn, awaking and stretching, awaking maybe to the sense pleasures of vibrant red flowers and fish. All that in his studio, reimagined as a sort of strange, arbitrary space, awash in a flood of blue, with a door behind opened to the outside. In this painting, there's a similar setup in a completely different mood. The goldfish are there again, hovering, now on a wooden table whose construction he's taken some pains to show you. There's more studio stuff in the room and a different technique using thicker paint and colors that stand out against a densely black background. The scene is familiar, but the treatment is unfamiliar. Back in a new, bigger studio on the Seine 2 years later, goldfish again. On the left, next to their bowl, a neglected houseplant reaches forlornly but gracefully towards the outside. The water brings the blue of the river and the sky into the room. The space in the room and the furniture in the window are warped, but anchored by the 2 oval forms of the fishbowl and another oval in the foreground. In the other painting on the right, it's really a tougher puzzle. Matisse's struggle with cubism has begun. We recognize the goldfish bowl and the apple, but we have some trouble with deciphering the rest. There's a one-legged table underneath the fishbowl, which isn't so clear. At the top right, there's a web of lines, diagonals, and under that, the artist's workplace, evidently, a table or a ledge, and a painter's palette that has a mysterious finger sticking out of the hole. I think the palette with a finger is a bit of inhumor, an allusion to the presence of the artist. It's a detail Picasso noticed, Matisse's admirer and competitor, who a year later did something similar when he included a palette with his own profile, can you see that on the left, in the Harlequin, which he thought might have been his most successful painting of all. I'm going on about these goldfish pictures because Matisse made them enigmatic on purpose, and they suggest ideas about sight and observation, what we see, what the painter has seen and turned into poetry, using the tools of the trade, color, composition, and the fiction of 3D. The fish see, too, although through curved glass out to our world, we don't know what they see. I mean, anybody who knows how to catch fish with lures, however, would know that fish have remarkably discriminating eyesight, by the way. Was Matisse speculating on their confinement in an artificial habitat for our amusement? Thinking about that calm little world within a world of the painter's studio, kind of microcosm? Matisse said this 30 years later: "Enraptured by light, I have often mentally abandoned that small space surrounding my motif, which it seems was sufficient for painters of the past, and I've dreamt of a space beyond myself, beyond all motifs, studios, even houses, a cosmic space in which one feels the walls no more than the fish does the sea." Well, this detour began with Moroccans observing goldfish. Matisse returned from Tangier to France with a lot more observations and images. One of his major projects was this assemblage of imagery from Morocco that again adapts some Cubist practices to his own imaging. He's been observing the mosques and the markets as well as the coffee shops, and he wrote to his friends to show them what he was up to. He sent them 2 drawings. There's a view from above and then down to a paved courtyard, and there's a small sketch at the top having some clues to the shapes on the big canvas, where the upper left there's this dome of a shrine, a marabout. And to that he's added some more architecture in the painting, and a railing, and a potted cactus that he's rendered with stripes, a nice touch. Down below, the gridded pavement has some market goods, melons laid out, green foliage, making a composition of circles that picks up the circular cactuses and the head of the turbaned man at the right with his back to us, pulling the composition together. In the big pink structure behind, there are openings, but it's not clear what they are. One striking thing here is the amount of black, which covers many campaigns of scraping and repainting, which is unusual, not unusual for Matisse, especially at this period of constant experimentation. Apropos that, 22 years before, Matisse had made this careful copy at the left of a giant Dutch 17th century still life in the Louvre. Now the test was to make a full-size reconstruction of the picture by what he called the methods of modern construction, which is his lovely euphemism for cubism. The methods of modern construction. He gave it squarer proportions. He divided it vertically into halves, then horizontally in quarters. He made a serpentine there at the right of the rising curve of the big tilted dish and the descending arc of the circular gilded frame behind it. He made the lute at the left speak across the picture to the wine cooler. And everywhere, geometry is emphasized. Relationships are made more obvious. The rich, dark, swagging canopy overhead becomes something like a folded canvas beach umbrella. The remake was ingenious, probably instructive for Matisse, and never repeated. Here's another case where Matisse is fully aware of Cubism, but has his own needs and his own methods. We look past a table in Matisse's upstairs bedroom through a window to the garden. On the table, 7 small items of the artist's belonging to the artist, carefully spaced out, none overlapping. Contrast this with the kind of still life Picasso was doing at the same time, and Matisse had been seeing familiar stuff like folded and crumpled newspapers on a table with a couple of dead game birds. Matisse had painted views of Notre Dame from his window from the Seine a dozen or so years ago, when in 1914, here in the middle, he went back to the window and did this large, unremarkable watercolor-ish scene, a mild surprise in its exactitude, and then this, and then an amazing apparition. The church seems to have grown and lost its towers and become translucent and levitated, despite being moored by perspective lines and a mottled blue that covers everything. There are just some signs of the riverbanks and the bridge. It's grounded with a splash of green foliage. And under the translucent blue, you can see a welter of lines drawn and redrawn in repeated attempts to resolve the perspective, or maybe complicate this perspective or undermine it in a Cubist spirit. Matisse invented other ways of organizing paintings. He had material all around him. In his own house, there were views he could make baffling, seemingly abstract, but still spring from the colors and relationships that stirred him. People who see this at the Museum of Modern Art are sometimes explain how familiar, how 1960s abstract this looks. When he was pressed about it, Matisse had some helpful things to say. He said, the curtain was red, the color of the yellow represents its lining, and the pattern was added by the artist. The green frame of the window suggests the green of the trees outside, and the cool contrast of the green of the trees and the blue sky necessitated a large mass of yellow, which to the artist signifies the vibration and the pleasure that he derived from the contrast of the trees and sky. It's not, therefore, a completely abstract picture, but a picture which has its roots in reality. So this is important. What gave him vibration and pleasure was the relation of form and color. He'd written this 7 years earlier. My choice of colors is based on observation, on feeling, and on the very nature of each experience. I merely try to find a color that will fit my sensation. Well, here's a color. I promised you surprises. Here's a color to end this lecture on. Matisse and his wife. I should say right away that it was Matisse's practice for most of his career to work all day, not in a smock, but in pajamas, which is a versatile item of Indian loungewear introduced by men in Victorian Britain. He and Amélie had a very strong and deep relationship. He worked almost all the time and did little else. She managed the household. She wrangled the teenage children. She looked after Matisse's business dealings, the galleries, the schedule, the deliveries, probably buying art supplies too. We can only guess what this enigma was meant to say, this picture, but the body language suggests quite a lot. She's in profile, seated imperiously, severe, like an ancient Near Eastern queen or a goddess, with black paint blotching her eye socket and forehead. He's also in profile with a sharp beard, and between them a garden, innocent and pleasant, with a tree and building, stylized, a nod to their own yard and studio. They confront one another on a field of supersaturated blue. It's a charged scene, but charged with what? Accusation? Judgment? Some kind of silent standoff. Well, there's more of this to come with the Matisses at home, so please come back when I give the third lecture in the series. Goodbye.